Good evening, and here is the news. It is 12 o'clock midnight, and the world has been struck by a terrible piece of news. It appears that the great master of Western thought and ideas, liberalism, has passed away at the tender age of 538. Liberalism died surrounded by family after succumbing to a brain aneurysm that was sustained, in a debate circuit with several leading intellectuals. In lieu of flowers, the family of liberalism would ask that you simply think about the meaning of its demise. Of course, when we speak about liberalism, we of course wish to remind viewers that liberalism is not the same as its cousin, confusingly also named liberalism, which persists in the United States and some areas of North America as meaning the same thing as liberalism, which causes a lot of confusion. The liberalism that passed away this evening is, of course, the liberalism of the Enlightenment, the liberalism of small liberty and values and individual freedom. The liberalism of the United States, of course, is the liberalism of welfare and the New Deal, which is a confusing byproduct of American history as to why the word liberalism doesn't match up with the concept of liberalism, but that's besides the point. Liberalism can be known for its many successes: conquering of the world, defeat of fascism, declaration of the end of history in the 1990s, when liberalism appeared to be completely dominant. It appeared that everyone was moving in one direction towards one continuous ideology. Liberalism, it was often quoted, was the pinnacle of human civilization. The idea that human individuals, and sometimes families, are at the very heart of human society. In fact, various sciences itself were created in response to liberalism's works, simply to measure how much of society's various factors had been caused by individuals and their choices. These things known as economics, the sciences of human reason and rationality and psychology, all were heavily influenced by liberalism and its ideas. Economics itself was paramount in allowing liberalism to become so supreme over the last several decades before its untimely death. But what exactly is the cause of liberalism's success? Well, liberalism, as we all know, is ultimately responsible for the downfall of the aristocracy, the downfall of monarchy, the downfall of the supremacy of God and the state and all that good stuff, and a transition into an understanding of humanity as a select variety of individuals who, if you just give freedom to, they will, through their own devices and needs and reasons, fight for themselves and for their family, and in doing so, rise up the invisible hand of the state. Liberalism, being well regarded towards the end of the mercantile era in the 1800s, became besieged by a number of other ideologies, namely the advanced communist powers and certain other kinds of welfarism and other ideas that effectively stated that the state itself could stand as a a way to ensure that society itself as a whole does not collapse. This, in the late 70s and 80s, was the very thing that liberalism sort of woke up and began attacking at its base level. In fact, the very discourse of our politics for the last 40, 50 years have been driven by a rejection in the 80s and 90s of the very idea that society exists, the very idea that society or that the state should exist, or that the state has ever existed outside of the mere whim of the social contract, as we all remember from high school philosophy. So where does that leave philosophy in the 1990s? Well, by the end of the 1990s, you have a situation wherein philosophers basically begin to abandon any precept that there is anything outside of the individual. Some take this to be much more literal, like Ayn Rand and her various proponents, such as the Republican Party, the Conservative Party in most countries, begin to effectively espouse this idea that if the government gets out of the way, we lower taxes, we lower regulation, people and their own devices will lead to a glorious development of wealth and ideas and freedom, quote unquote. You have to understand this is in direct contrast to a conception that either the state should exist or it does exist, in contradiction to this idea of more or less individuals. Now, this debate, of course, did not come out of nowhere. It's not merely a creation of the 70s and 80s and 90s. It is, however, it found itself, liberalism found its footing and standed most at the height of its power, honestly, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, after it had finally managed to defeat the last remnant of the idea that, well, maybe there is something to this whole idea of collaboration and the state. So why, then, has liberalism managed to die? This seemingly immortal idea, which has ruled Canada, at least, my home country, for hundreds of years at this point, it's almost as long as Canada's existed. What, then, has caused liberalism's death? Well, there are two fundamental problems with the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Fundamentally, the idea of getting rid of the government, of moving the government out of the way, lowering taxes, lowering regulation, all that, led to something known as austerity. Austerity is a series of policy prescriptions which states that you should cut as much as possible. You should try to get rid of as many services as possible within reason, and do as much as you can to get people acting independently. Why have people in mental health institutions when they could be having their families take care of them, or they could be taking care of themselves on the street? Why fund buses and public transit when people have cars and they can drive around? Why fund health care when people should be able to find and scrounge together the few $1,000s they have left, in order to pay for their child's cancer treatment? When you give people the ability and to effectively fight for themselves, the argument went, you will see a rise in efficiency. But the thing that's critically you need to understand, that's critical to understand, is the fact that this rise of wealth that occurred in the 1980s and 90s is not because of this cutting and this retreat of the state. It is in fact in spite of it. What occurred was that the 1980s, 90s, and 70s, that 30-year span, was the beginning of globalization, the beginning of the involvement of the entire world in manufacturing, the beginning of hiring more and more and more of the world's population in the production of the useless items that you have strewn about your house. This led to a lot of wealth because you have American and Canadian, North American and British and European companies which have all of these patents and all of these capabilities and all the technology, and all they had to do was simply find a cheap workforce to manufacture it. And what this caused was, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it caused a reduction in wages. In fact, if you look at charts, wages in North America haven't increased at all, except to just barely match inflation. So effectively, currently, if you're working full-time, you're making about the same as you would be making in 1972, according to recent charts. Plus or minus a couple $100, of course. So where does this leave liberalism? Well, suddenly you have this sort of strange sense that there's not as much wealth as there used to be. People feel as though they're being pulled tighter, like a rubber band being pulled tight. People feel afraid at every bit. And why is this? Well, it's because society is expecting more of them and providing them less wages to do it with. And what happened? Well, over time, people did their best, as they often did, but as the decades wore on, people are now in a situation where they are massively, massively in debt in the first world. We're talking about the developed world here. People have never been in more debt now than they have ever been. And the thing that's a problem with this is that this debt is not a debt or an investment in a future thing. It's not just student loans. It's not just housing. It's consumption. It's debt on the variability to have the same life that you would have thought you would have had in the 1960s and 50s. There's almost guaranteed to you if you're just some Joe Schmo who was able to pass high school and go work at the Ford assembly plant or whatever. Now, what this has caused is that a vast majority of our politicians and their ideas, and the vast majority of intellectuals, the vast majority of newspaper writers, editorialists, etc., the only idea that they had was, well, we just get rid of the state, get people out of there. What will happen is that people, again, the individual, will rise to the occasion. And that simply hasn't happened. What we're seeing is that you're seeing less of an ability for people to rise in wealth and income. You're seeing a rise in hopelessness, a rise in debt. And overall, there is a large sense that things are not working. I don't think you need to have much of a perception of the world's state of affairs for you to understand that, well, things are a little chaotic, if you understand. Now, where does that leave our friends' liberalism? Now, after the 2008 crisis, they tried reinstating. Effectively, there was this idea that, well, what we should do is we should stimulate the economy. You see, liberalism, in its wisdom, decided that if you're not going to just cut, what you need to do is you need to do whatever is necessary to maintain business. We need to work for jobs. If you listen to every politician for the past 30, 40 years, all they've been saying is we need to get the jobs back. We need to fight for the jobs. We need to negotiate for the jobs. We're going to give this factory a tax cut. We're going to give this factory some sort of tax break, and we're going to give them all the things. We're going to give them free power and free roads and free infrastructure. We're going to do the best we can to ensure that our citizens have access to those jobs. Why? Because the government effectively sort of shaped itself to do whatever it takes to satisfy the needs of the wealthy, of those with means, of those with wealth, and which those in academia refer to as capitalists. capitalists effectively can go anywhere in the world. They can invest in any place in the world. So if you decide to raise taxes in your little area of Wisconsin or whatever, they could go to Arkansas. They could go to Mexico. They could go to Sri Lanka. They could go to literally anywhere they feel like. Because liberalism itself has empowered capital to sort of be able to go anywhere it wants in this planet. And it has made it so that the entire planet effectively allows capital to spread itself out amongst all of the various facets of our world. So, where does that leave the politician in your local constituency? Where does that leave them? Well, they can't raise taxes. They can't do that. And they have to invest in jobs, right? That's the two things they have to do. So what they'll do is they'll obtain more debt. And they'll start borrowing. Where are they going to get the money from? Well, they'll get the money from capitalists. They'll get the money from the rich. Okay, great. So we're going to borrow money from the rich to make things easier for the rich to make money. And then pay the rich interest on the money we just borrowed from them. Why? It's simply because the individual is in charge of everything, and these individuals happen to have more money than the average person. Therefore, we should do whatever we can to make sure that these job creators are able to do whatever it is that they do to create jobs, and that will cause wealth to occur. And it's this idea of trickling down, or as I like to call it, trickling upon. But you see, liberalism has died. Why? Because this idea is, well, people are realizing that the basket of options of the normal politician is rather bare. People are looking elsewhere. Sometimes it's stupid things. Sometimes it's really silly ideas like, well, we should limit immigration. We have a capital which is able to go anywhere on the planet, but God forbid that some workers might come into our place and make things. Because people who are anti-immigration are ultimately do not actually understand any facet of the economy for reasons that are too complicated to get into. But you have a large stash of anti-immigrant sentiment all across Europe and all across the United States and in Canada as well, and in much of the first world, in direct contrast to this idea that, well, if we need to just we need to break down barriers, we need to bring everyone together. You're seeing a backlash against that. You're seeing Brexit in the European Union. You're seeing a lot of attacks on various trade deals, negotiations. Why? Because people have realized that this idea of bringing down the barriers to the individual is a bit absurd and is not working. And ultimately, we run into another set of problems. We run into two more problems. Number one is that the entire conception of the economy, which is based on the model of the individual being rational, doing rational things, buying things because they have a subjective want for that thing, which they value at a certain dollar amount, and they buy it, and all that good stuff. But the issue is, dear viewer, people aren't rational. I know that's not news to you, but people don't think rationally. They can't really think rationally, and also unless you're describing a very fixed set of circumstances, you can't even really measure all of the causes of their behavior. Why can't you? Well, it's because humans, by their brains, are quite, and by their memories, and by all of the society that's around them, and all the people that they know, and all the things that they like to do, and their whole memory of their whole life, and everything else. People are complex. People have weird obsessions with things. People really, really, really care about certain sections of Star Wars, or certain canons of Star Trek, and people have very strong opinions about Kim Kardashian, and These are not rational or easily understood things, but ultimately there is a lack of, there's no mysticism about it. People are driven by a kind of cause and effect. It's just that you can't simplify the cause and effect to mere rationality. And to do so can give you a model of the world, but doesn't give you a full understanding of the world. And it's this realization that has caught most of the educated, well, with their pants down. It's caught in a lot of people who have spent many years of their lives studying and making mathematical models of human rationality. It's made all that work kind of pointless. Kind of. There is use in it. I'm not denying it completely, but it's just the individual is not a good place to start when you're trying to understand society. Which sounds paradoxical, because what is society if it's not a group of individuals? But go back to my earlier point. If you understand that humans are, in fact, created by the situation that they find themselves within. Humans are created by the sum total of all their memories, sum totals of all their beliefs, feelings, the opinions of others that are around them, the people they know, the family that is around them, the friends, their neighbors, the society, the media, everything that's around them. Human beings are the sum total of that life experience. And it's not rational, but it is causal. And what is the cause? Well, for a vast majority of it, humans share a lot of experiences. A lot of people, you must have met them, have had similar experiences to yourself. A lot of people happened to have their hair the same way as you, happened to wear the same clothes as you, happened to speak the same language as you, happened to, well, talk about the same Game of Thrones episode that you just saw, happened to have read the same tweets, happened to have experienced very similar things. And if what you are is a pure reaction to your experience, and if experience is not completely unique, of course, everyone has a completely slightly separate view or an angle on the subject, but people are all more or less seeing the same thing. So, what is this thing? What is this thing that we're seeing? Well, that's society. And an individual might show up as a permutation of society, as a single dot in the larger expanse of society. But if you want to understand chemistry, you don't start with quarks. You don't start looking at one quark. You don't say, that's one quark. We're going to understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. You could do that, but you wouldn't. Of course, using physics as an analogy for social science is never a smart thing, but bear with me for a minute. You would never understand the properties of the atom or of the molecule if you start at such a base, fundamental level. And it's this realization that has ultimately killed liberalism. But the actual thing that killed liberalism is the fundamental realization that, well, if people are experiencing the same thing and they are a reaction to all of these causes, just like how if you shake water, the fact that the water moved around just because you shook it, it's not mysterious. Nothing mysterious about why the water is moving. Now, individual water molecules might be moving around in weird directions, and that might be, not exactly knowable at any one moment, but the reason the water is shaking is because you shook it. There is a cause and effect. We do live in a universe of reality, This is not something that we need to debate. Now, what this means is that, well, the human mind is, well, it is incredibly complex. It is knowable in the sense that it is entirely driven by causality, and it is simply a reaction to those causes. So, what does this mean, dear viewer? Well, this means that you are entirely entangled in your society. You're entirely entangled in everything around you, from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep. You're entangled in every other thing that is around you, and you're not unique in that. You're not removed from that. You're not divorced from it. You're not separate from it. You are deeply entrenched in it. You're swimming in it, effectively. And so when you understand the human mind in this sense, where is free will? Where is it? And if there's no free will, how can you really point to an individual and say that, well, they reasonably did this thing, or they just determined this sort of thing, when you understand that free will itself does not exist? Now, a person could be doing something without realizing it. A person could be acting rationally or irrationally without knowing. Of course, I admit that. But the thing that's important to know is that if the individual is simply a reaction to the society that is formed whenever two or more humans are present, and that history of that society and the things in that society and the creations of that society and the failures of that society, why do we then focus so much on the individual? And I think that thought crossed liberalism's brain for just a brief moment. And I think that may have been what caused the aneurysm. With that, I would accept your thoughts and prayers, but they don't really matter. What I would accept is if you were to share this with someone. Thank you for listening.